Dames en heren, goedemiddag. Deze is niet nodig, maar ik gebruik hem wel, want we worden live gestreamd, dat u het alvast weet. Welkom bij deze middag van de VVOJ, die mede mogelijk is gemaakt door de NVJ en door de LIRA. We hebben zoveel leuke vriendjes de laatste tijd. En door beeld en geluid, daar kom ik zo meteen nog op terug. Even voor het begrip, wie hier is geen VVOJ-lid? Oké. De meeste dus wel, want jullie weten ongetwijfeld, dit is eigenlijk een ledenvergadering. Die doen we 2 keer per jaar. De ene keer is tijdens de conferentie, dan komt iedereen vanzelf. En de andere keer moeten wij altijd een lokkertje bedenken om mensen naar de ledenvergadering te halen. Het lokkertje heet Nick Davies, daar kom ik zo meteen op terug. Zoals ik al zei, de VVOJ organiseert deze middag. Wij zijn een vereniging, even voor de mensen die geen lid zijn. Sorry, moeten jullie even aanhoren. We zijn een vereniging, dus jullie kunnen lid worden of donateur worden. Dan werk je mee aan een vereniging die ervoor zorgt dat de kwaliteit van onderzoeksjournalistiek wordt bevorderd. Je werkt mee aan een netwerk van journalisten die elkaar kunnen opzoeken, hun kennis kunnen delen. En je werkt ook mee aan het lobbyen voor nog betere en meer onderzoeksjournalistiek. Bijvoorbeeld de 5 miljoen die eraan zit te komen, daar mogen we gelukkig een beetje over meepraten. We zijn wel heel benieuwd wat het nou precies gaat worden. De brief ligt bij het kabinet, nog een maandje heb ik begrepen. En dan gaat bekend worden waar dat geld naartoe gaat. Wij hebben voor deze bijeenkomst Nick Davies uitgenodigd. En dat is omdat 10 jaar geleden zijn boek Flat Earth News verscheen. In het Nederlands vertaald als Gebakken Lucht. Daar is hij het niet helemaal mee eens, zei hij al in de trein. Het boek gaat over de dingen die we nu eigenlijk allemaal kennen als bijna jammer genoeg vanzelfsprekend. In feite heeft Nick Davies in die tijd dat hij het boek schreef geconstateerd dat er iets wezenlijks aan het veranderen was in de journalistiek. Waardoor eigenlijk de fundamenten werden gelegd voor een verdienmodel waarin journalistiek niet meer noodzakelijkerwijs de best possible version of the truth is. Maar er ontstonden allerlei verschijnselen die we nu maar al te goed kennen. Distortion, trollen, fake facts, alternative facts, fake news. Nou ja, we gaan er straks allemaal over praten. Maar ik geef graag eerst even het woord aan Hans van der Wind, die jullie graag namens beeld en geluid ook welkom wil heten hier.
Dankjewel, Tanja. Goedemiddag inderdaad bij Beeld en Geluid. Mijn naam is Hans van der Wind. Ik vond het wel leuk dat je net vroeg van wie is er lid van de VVOJ. Ik zou ook willen weten wie is er wel eens bij Beeld en Geluid geweest. Oh, dat zijn er nog best veel. En wisten jullie ook dat wij als Beeld en Geluid zijn gefuseerd met het Persmuseum? Wie wist dat? Oh, oké. En waren jullie wel eens bij het Persmuseum geweest? Nou, wat een feest der herkenning. Wij zijn dus vorig jaar gefuseerd met het Persmuseum. En wij zijn dus ook sinds die fusie verantwoordelijk voor het opkomen voor persvrijheid en het zorgen dat het perserfgoed goed wordt bewaard. Dat ligt nog steeds in Amsterdam, dat is ook voorlopig zo de bedoeling. Het ligt nog steeds in hetzelfde gebouw waar het Persmuseum zat. Maar we zijn ons nu ook wel aan het oriënteren hoe wij in ons collectiebeleid pers en journalistiek nog een betere plek kunnen geven dan het al had. Want wij zijn natuurlijk Beeld en Geluid, het audiovisuele archief van Nederland. Daarin zit pers en journalistiek eigenlijk het journalistieke informatieve deel altijd al. Dat is een groot genre binnen onze collectie. Zowel publieke omroepen als van commerciële omroepen archiveren wij. Dat laatste van de commerciële omroepen, dat doen wij op eigen gezag. Voor de publieke omroep hebben wij een publieke taak. Daar worden we ook door gefinancierd door OCMW. Maar dat heeft voor onze programmering de afgelopen tijd ook best wel wat verandering gebracht. Want wij proberen nu elk jaar, en voorheen was dat niet jaarlijks, journalistiek onder de aandacht te brengen van ons publiek. En het publiek bestaat voor een groot deel uit families, gezinnen die hier, zoals jullie het misschien net gezien hebben, op zondag en in het weekend en in de vakanties graag langskomen. En een groot deel van het andere publiek zijn de scholen. Wij hebben hier elke week educatieve workshops. Die worden goed bezocht door middelbare scholen. En ook door scholen uit het primaire onderwijs. Groep 7, groep 8 leerlingen komen hier wekelijks langs. En journalistiek is het afgelopen jaar ook bij ons op de dag van de persvrijheid aan het licht gekomen. We hebben hier in de meivakantie een heel nieuwsprogramma gedraaid voor gezinnen, maar ook voor hele andere doelgroepen. En onder andere de dag van de persvrijheid is hier met het Festival van het Vrije Woord geweest. Vandaag zijn we heel blij dat we de VVOJ kunnen ontvangen en samen aan het publiek dus Nick Davies kunnen presenteren. In september is Joris Luijendijk hier nog. En wij proberen zo elke keer andere perspectieven op nieuws en de ontwikkeling in de media te presenteren. En we hopen u daar van harte nog eens een keer te ontvangen. U kunt geen lid worden van Beeld en Geluid, maar u kunt ons wel ondersteunen door af en toe een bezoekje te brengen aan onze programmering of gewoon aan de experience. Ik wens u veel plezier vanmiddag en dan geef ik het woord direct door aan Frederique en Nick. Ik geef het woord terug aan Tanja.
Dankjewel, Hans. And yes, let's switch to English. I have to make apologies to you, Nick, because I started introducing you in Dutch, which is not very polite. So let me.
I've no idea how rude you've been. It's tricky.
No, well, they started to smile and they looked enthusiastic. So I think it went well. But just to do it right, we invited Nick Davies over because 10 years ago he published Flat Earth News, which sort of laid the groundwork for, I think, what was an interpretation of the news media system that was quite new at the time. It caused quite a stir. I remember the book at that time, because what Nick Davies portrayed it was that the system that we used to work in and that sort of guaranteed that journalism was the best possible version of the truth, that system was starting to crack a bit. It didn't work anymore. And the subtitle of your book was that you were reporting on distortion and on things like fake news. There were all sorts of words in the book that we now recognize all too well in the Trump era. So we are very curious of how you look yourself back on the book that you wrote then and what lines you can draw between then and now. And Nick Davies is going to be interviewed by Frederique de Jonge. And now I've talked long enough, so Frederique, all yours.
Thank you, Tanja. Well.
It's okay.
Yeah. Glad to have you here, Nick Davies. As Tanja said, we're going to talk about what you wrote back then in your book and how you look on journalism these days. Okay. Just to make it clear to the audience, you're a retired journalist.
I'm a retired old gentleman. I need to be handled gently.
Yeah, I will try that.
Yeah, no, I stopped work 20 months ago.
Yeah, you're counting the months even.
Yeah, no, it's gorgeous.
Yeah. So since you only want to do nice things, as you told me, do you consider talking about journalism still as something nice?
Yeah, well, actually, there's a big subject lurking in the background there. So I'm still very interested in journalism, and I'm still very interested in the world. I read the Guardian website for probably an hour each day. But having retired, the retirement coincided with a belief that journalism is losing its importance. And that's partly because of what's there in Flat Earth News, that our ability to tell the truth is in a sharp decline. So we are worth less than we used to be. But then, sorry, I talk a lot. There's a bigger problem which that question kind of goes to, which is to do with, I completely lost my faith in journalism. And that's because, as so many things in life, it's about the internet. So I became a journalist in the mid-1970s because of Watergate. The two guys armed only with notebooks and pens could bring down the most powerful politician in the world because he was corrupt. They used words as weapons to create change. That's the idea. And it was clearly possible to do that then, and it remained possible. But I think it's become almost impossible now. And that's because, first of all, because of the internet, there is so much babble out there. There are so many words that it's very difficult to break through. It's like, I've said before, walking around in a football ground where the stadium is full of people and they're all shouting and singing and you don't have a microphone. So you can do the big story and it's there on the website or on the front page of the paper. And some people notice it. Within 3 or 4 hours, it's the second item on the website. Within 24 hours, it's history. It didn't break through. It didn't get heard. And then, even if you succeed in breaking through, which can still happen, and suddenly everybody is talking about your story, Then there's now a second problem, also, which is about the internet, which is that the public domain, the space in which people discuss how our societies should be run, is now horribly infected with falsehood and unreason, the two most important components of debate.
So
even if you break through, you don't get a result. The world just carries on talking nonsense around you. So that wonderful idea that you can use words as weapons seems to me almost, not quite, almost dead. Back to you.
Almost dead. So is it still necessary for you? Do you think it's still necessary to talk about journalism, or did you kind of give it up?
No, so I mean, you could look at a kind of addiction. I did it for 40 years, so I still think about it and talk about it. And you may say I'm wrong in my pessimism, but I mean, the world is in such a difficult position. Our capacity to find solutions is so far reduced that I wonder if there's any form of activism that can generate results. So it's not just journalism, but holding demonstrations in the streets, signing petitions, talking to your political representative. How many of these things actually penetrate and start to affect the decisions that are made? It's all been reduced in its effect, I think.
So before we get to your actual pessimism, let's take a step back to 10 years ago when your book came out. Were you already this pessimistic back then when you started your book?
No. We can talk about the book. I think that so I was a reporter for 40 years. In the summer of 2011, kind of 37 years in, I hit my personal moment of maximum power, where I did a story which had the whole power elite in the United Kingdom running around screaming in panic. This was the phone hacking saga, which is really a story about power in the UK.
But this is what you worked on after Flat Earth.
Yes, but my point is just the immediate, I know I talk too much, I'm so sorry, but that blew up. Everybody's shouting, everybody's screaming, and now, 7 years later, you look back. What did we achieve? Well, we achieved almost nothing. So that's what made me really lose my faith, that something has changed out there of the context within which we work that means that we have less power than we used to create change. So, but at the time I wrote Flat Earth News, I was still young and naive.
And what made you write the book? Because there was some alarm for you.
Yeah. So this was all about the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. So that's March 2003, the invasion. Just for what it's worth, personally, I was in favor of the invasion, not because of the WMD, but because I think it's rational and good to use violence against bad people. If I was an Iraqi living with a dictator who uses torture and murder and massacre, I'd say, get in here and kill this guy. Do whatever you have to do. But it really frustrated me that after the invasion, the dust settles. Oh, there are no weapons of mass destruction. And media organizations reacted to that as if it was a problem about governments and intelligence agencies dealing in misinformation. Whereas, of course, those two players were engaging with a third, ourselves. And the absolute refusal of most news organizations to acknowledge that they had poured out stories which misled their readers and viewers and listeners. I found that really frustrating. So I thought, okay, let's try and work out, why does this happen? Why would we take the biggest story of the decade and get it 100% wrong? So that's where it started.
That's where it started.
Yeah.
And you had to maybe criticize your colleagues and yourself.
Yeah.
What came out of that?
Well, so it was weird, actually. You know, in the UK newspapers in Fleet Street, we have a saying, dog doesn't eat dog. And that means we write about everybody else. But hey, guys, let's write about each other. This is omerta. So it was interesting because there were some journalists, particularly the senior people, who were really angry that I was doing this. But what was maybe more significant was that lots and lots of ordinary reporters wanted it done because they could see the same as me, that things were going very bad in our profession.
They told you that during...
During the research?
Yeah.
Yeah. So I was talking to lots of reporters about the stories behind stories, and they wanted to talk, to say what was going wrong. So then, I mean, the picture that emerges is slightly complex, but so the biggest single thing that this was about was we started to use a word, somebody else invented it, churnalism. You know, you churn milk to make it into butter. It goes round and round. And so instead of talking journalism, churnalism, because you can see that news organizations now take in a mass of second-hand material, not stuff that they themselves have researched, and they churn it, they recycle it unchecked into the news. And this second-hand material comes from news agencies like Reuters, and even more important, it comes from the PR industry. So,
which were for a long time seen as objective news organizations.
Yeah, well, the news agencies, that word objective I think is problematic.
Well, I'm talking about, let's say, 30 years ago.
Yeah, no, but it's just the concept of objectivity. But if you want to say...
That turned out later, right?
Yeah, but the people who work for news organizations are good reporters, and they will... You can rely that what they're saying is probably accurate. But there's the first point. You talk to the reporters at a news agency like Reuters, they will say, our job is not to tell the truth. Our job is to be accurate. Well, now what's the difference? The difference is this. If George Bush stands up and says, there are weapons of mass destruction all over Iraq, the agency reporter's job is to report that accurately. It is absolutely not an agency's job to check and discover whether that's true. If it says the earth is flat, then that will be reported accurately. It's up to the news organizations to discover whether or not it's true. They're different words. So that and we did a lot of research on this. I mean, there were statistics and percentages attached to these conclusions. But to an enormous extent, a newsroom is now sitting there recycling that agency copy without checking. So if you want to mislead the world on a subject, it isn't difficult anymore. You don't have to go in to a smoke-filled room and have a big cigar with the proprietor and then interfere with the journalist. It's much easier than that. Just stand up and say it. And if the agency reports it, it's on its way into the news. And then over here, you have the PR industry.
Sorry, before you get to the PR industry, is this how it went wrong with the weapons of mass destruction?
Partly.
This churning, Flat Earth News? How did that work?
Yes.
Did you find it out, how it went wrong?
So if you look at the weapons of mass destruction, I mean, there were tens of thousands of stories. I haven't done this research, but if we said, how many of those stories were checked? How many of the reporters went out and tried to establish whether those WMD are there? I mean, it would be less than 1%. I mean, this is staggering, but that's normal. And there are some reporters who would say, oh, well, how the hell am I supposed to know if there are WMD in Iraq? Well, there are two answers to that. One, if you don't know, don't fucking say they're there. What are you? You're a journalist, not a fantasist. But the second thing is, you can check. You can check. Do you remember there was a weapons inspector, retired, called Scott Ritter? And whenever possible, he would come up on radio and television and say, hang on a minute, I was there. I don't think the WMD are there. There was Hans Blick, this long-suffering Danish guy in charge. And he was being terribly even-handed. But at the end of the day, he was still looking, but he never found. Listen to Hans, listen to Scott. Go and talk to them and find out who else they know who's working in the same profession. There are
so why
sources
didn't
there.
Journalists listen to them?
Because so this gets to the underlying thing. This is a complicated picture, slightly difficult to put out in a meeting like this, but...
We have the time.
Okay. So the underlying problem is that the resources, the money, are being sucked out of newsrooms. We did a big piece of research and found that the amount of space in a printed newspaper that was being filled by the average national news reporter in the UK had trebled over the previous 20 years, right? So they're filling 3 times as much space as they used to. And if you turn that around, it means that story by story, each of those reporters has, on a rough average, only 1/3 of the time to do each story, because they've got fewer resources in the newsroom. They're having to do more stories each day. Now, if you take away time from a reporter, you're taking away their most important raw material. It's like taking away the steel from people who are making cars. We can't do our jobs properly anymore. We can't go out and find stories. We can't check. So then we start to rely on the agency copy and the PR material. And then you ask how much, we did ask, how much of this is being checked? Because the answer you want is 100%. I've got a feeling the answer we came up with was 12% of the stories showed evidence of being checked. This was on a huge survey of stories. That's terrifying.
But what had the fact to do, I mean, it was even more difficult because this story of the weapons of mass destruction was also military information. It was presented as intelligence information. So is that harder to check, or would you say it's not?
I think if you start off by saying this is going to be hard to check, you're not going to do your job properly. It's checkable. There are human sources there. In the universities, there are academics who study these areas all their life. They've got information. A lot of them have contacts with current intelligence agencies. I don't know of anybody anywhere in the world in the profession of journalism who tried to check that story. Do you?
No.
It's staggering. But that's not uncommon. I think that the model that gives you WMD in Iraq is the standard model that now applies to journalism. So what the subtitle of the book is, it says it's about falsehood, distortion, and propaganda in news. So I'm saying if you cut the staff, you have us recycling unchecked second-hand material, we are structurally likely to produce falsehood and distortion and propaganda. This is not the occasional mistake we make and, oh my God, it's the standard practice. So you will have had here the story about Mr. Skripal and his daughter who were found almost dead in this provincial city, Salisbury. The level of reporting about that is right down at the level of WMD. I have not seen any evidence of any British journalist checking anything. And should we talk about this for 2 minutes?
Yes,
it's quite,
yes.
This is not unusual.
So what did you didn't see anything, or you saw things
Skripal?
that were, yeah.
No, I have not seen a single British journalist checking a single element of the Skripal story. And there are huge gaps in this story. So first
what
of all,
is the story as you know it?
Hang on, I will tell you. But so first of all, I'm perfectly happy to recognize that Vladimir Putin and his people are gangsters. They are ransacking the Russian economy for money, for themselves and their families, and they kill people. They also kill journalists. At home, over my desk, I have a picture of Anna Politkovskaya, this incredibly brave woman who was killed because she was upsetting the Kremlin over Chechnya. So I don't have any problem seeing them as gangsters, but what happened in Salisbury? First of all, the best source on this is the Prime Minister, Theresa May. You go back to what happened when she first spoke about this in our parliament, 3 days after the attack. She stands up and she says, this was Novichok, a word I had never heard before. And she says, there are only 2 possible explanations. Hang on, Theresa, what did you say? 2 possible explanations. Now listen, she says. One is that the Russian state organized a murder conspiracy in UK territory. Well, okay, if that's true, let us expel 23 diplomats from the Russian embassy and launch a war of words. But Theresa says there's a second explanation possible. She says it may be that the Russians have lost control of their stockpile of nerve gas. Now, why is she saying that? This is a speech that has been worked on by all of the intelligence agencies. That is because that's there in their records. It's there in press coverage from when Boris Yeltsin was in the Kremlin. There were lots of stories that as the Soviet Union collapses, we're all worried that they could lose control of their chemical, biological, or nuclear weapons. Okay, the Prime Minister says that may be the explanation. So what have you got to do if you're a journalist and not just a fantasist, not just going to run around saying what everybody else says? You have to go to this organization for the prohibition of chemical weapons. What do you know? You find people who worked there 20 years ago. What do you know? You get into the academics at the universities. Is it true? Now, there's a second thing missing from this story, because at the time, the speculation was that these weapons might fall into the hands of terrorist groups or organized crime. Now, big question. What is Mr. Skripal doing for a living? So there is nothing that justifies what was done to that man. But we need to understand why something happened to him. So let's ask, what's he been doing with his time? How is it that, so he will have a modest amount of money from British intelligence. He has a modest little house on the edge of Salisbury. But what is he doing? Just sitting there all day watching daytime television? Or is he perhaps trying to earn a bit more money? Is it possible that he's doing business deals in Russia? If he is, has he possibly come up against somebody who's really, really angry with him about a business deal and who has connections to an organized crime group that might perhaps have got hold of the Novichok that has escaped from the stockpile? There's an alternative explanation there. And this is only a theory. But what journalists do is they take theories and they investigate that word to find out if they're true. And this begins with the Prime Minister. This doesn't begin with a lunatic in a dark corner in an old alley. The Prime Minister says that explanation is possible. Do you see?
You started by saying that you're still reading The Guardian 1 hour a day.
Yeah.
So I guess you've been following this story, and not even The Guardian was able to.
No, The Guardian's coverage has been really sadly bad as anybody else's. It's really a shame. But I was talking in Vienna. I do talk a lot, a week ago. And we were talking about the press.
And people are still listening, so that's great.
It suddenly occurred to me that if you want to create a mental image of a news organization, it's like a big, fat cow. And it's sitting there and it doesn't have very much energy. And it doesn't really think very much. And it doesn't even eat all the beautiful green grass around it. Those are real stories. What it does is it regurgitates the old shit that's in its stomach and then chews on it. This is the second-hand material, you understand, that it's recycling. But then I've had this sitting here, another thought, that a cow is basically harmless unless all the cows get together and start all running around in a stampede. Then they're dangerous. And this is what is happening with Skripal. All the British newspapers, and maybe others in Europe, are all running around saying exactly the same thing, just as they did with the WMD in Iraq, just as they do so often. And then they're dangerous, because they're not doing their job, they're not checking. At the end of the day, it may well be that it was the Kremlin who tried to kill Skripal. If it was, we don't understand why. This guy was last a Russian spy working for Russian intelligence in 2006. That's when they realized he was also working for the British. They didn't kill him then. They arrested him. They put him on trial. They convicted him. They didn't sentence him to death or even to life. They gave him 13 years in prison. And after only 4 years, when they wanted to do a swap, they said, OK, you can feck off. Well, so then why 8 years later did they decide to kill him? Imagine you're Vladimir Putin sitting in your Kremlin office with your feet up on the desk, cleaning your fingernails with a sharpened knife. Who shall I kill? Why is Skripal suddenly at the top of the list? Even if it is Vladimir, we don't understand why. So maybe I'm going on about this a bit too long, but
no, this is a good actual example.
But if you're going to function like a news organization, there are these huge gaps, and we're supposed to interrogate the gaps, and nobody is doing it.
And this actual story for you counts as proof that nothing changed after your book.
Yes, but I'm saying that's the standard model. So you'll see it in the smaller stories as well. I mean, across the board, it's scary when you look at it.
But why is it, because you're telling also that after the book was published, many journalists, some wanted to kill you, but many journalists all over the world applauded and emailed you by saying, this is great, we need to acknowledge this. And then what? They all presented themselves as victims of the system, or did they really change something?
Well, I think the first thing is there are a lot of very good journalists still working, but they work in bad organizations that don't allow them to do their job properly because of the things I'm trying to describe. So a lot of journalists were glad that we were finally talking about this, but that doesn't mean you can change things, because the basic problem is financial. And in the 10 years since the book was published, I would think things have got worse, because this is, again, the internet, and specifically Facebook and Google, these two unbelievably greedy...
The churning masters.
They're greedy and destructive. They're licensed thieves. These are not good people. But they did this amazing thing for years. They were giving away the stories that we produced for free. So we spend all that money researching things, and it's like if you had a shop selling apples and oranges, and along come Mr. Facebook and Mr. Google, take the apples and the oranges and hand them out in the street. And we all sat there and said, oh yeah, that's nice, maybe we'll get some advertising. So, and then about 3 or 4 years ago, they realized that, hang on, during that first phase, people who wanted to read The Guardian or any other newspaper very frequently accessed those websites through Facebook and Google. And what happened 3 or 4 years ago was that people began to realize that the most valuable commodity on the internet is not a hit. We thought at The Guardian, if we're getting hits on our website, then we're winning, because the next thing that happens is that the advertising comes. Wrong, we didn't understand. The most valuable commodity on the internet is not a hit, it's user data. And Facebook and Google woke up to this 3 or 4 years ago. We've got the user data of all those newspaper readers. They're all coming through us. So then they start crunching it together and selling the advertising, and at cheaper rates. So the number of hits on the Guardian website goes up and up and up, and the advertising suddenly starts to go down. So now they're not only handing out our apples and oranges, they're coming into the shop, they're opening the till and taking the cash. It's outrageous. So then, if you think that the problems of journalism, the Flat Earth News, begin with shortage of resources in the newsroom, now the resources are being torn out. So The Guardian lost 20% of its staff, just removed through redundancy programs, and they're still making people redundant. Just in the last week, a very senior journalist at The Guardian has taken redundancy. So the staff are still being reduced, which means you are more likely to do this terrible low-standard work. There's other factors in there as well, but
talking about
aggressive.
Talking about, so this is a clear downside of the internet, but
yeah.
I think there are some upsides if you look at, for example, the investigative journalistic platforms that grew since your book came out, and even before, like ProPublica, or here in the Nederlandse Correspondent, Follow the Money, The Intercept, all kinds of...
Okay.
What do you say about that?
Well, so what you can see is the journalistic profession all over the developed world where the internet has had this impact, looking for alternative models. So ProPublica and The Intercept, and indeed the Washington Post, are examples of very, very rich people saying, okay, here's some money, let's try and save your journalistic operation. Now, there's a limited extent to which we can rely for our future on very rich people saying, here, have a huge pile of money.
Why is there a limited extent? If there are enough millionaires saying that, and they keep on saying this, we don't know.
Well, first of all, there is 2 different kinds of billionaires out there. So there are some, like it's the eBay guy who does The Intercept, isn't it? There's this construction family in the States that does ProPublica. They are benign. They say, have the money, and I'm not going to interfere. But over here, there's masses more billionaires who say, here, have some money, and I'm going to interfere all day long. That's an extremely dangerous model.
Examples of that?
Yes, so we have this awful Russian oligarch who owns the Evening Standard and the Independent in the UK. I don't trust him as far as I could throw him, and I'm getting old and weak. I couldn't throw him very far at all. These people should not be allowed near newspapers. And we've had people like Rupert Murdoch as well. But billionaires owning news organizations is not generally well thought of.
Okay, but this is only one part, and the other part is reader-funded platforms.
Yes, the crowdfunding.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we call it, yes. So you can see people looking for the model, alternatives. If they can make them work, great. Well, I mean, whatever works, let's try it, because we're in trouble.
Well, you don't sound very positive.
Well, maybe I'm wrong, but I doubt whether the billionaire or the crowdfunding is going to be big enough to replace the 2 key streams of income which we've lost from the sale of printed papers and advertising. Well, we're in the process of losing. We haven't finally lost either of them. But I don't know. We'll have
I
to...
think we're far from replacing it, but they can exist next to each other.
Yeah, that's true. No, so I mean, I welcome ProPublica. I welcome
No,
the
you're
Intercept.
against them.
No, I'm not against them.
I'm joking.
No, so thank God they're there.
But you don't still, you don't have this idea that since, if we compare it with 10 years ago, because in your book you state, okay, maybe we should untangle commerce and journalism. Maybe that's the only solution. Put away the money-making So here there are some examples in the world of non-profit organizations. And now you say, well, yes, I don't know.
No, they're good. I'm saying they're good, but whether or not they can replace what we're losing is the question.
Yeah, but replacing, is that the only goal we...
Well, I would hope. Yes, that is the goal. But the thing is, at the moment, none of the existing big news organizations are anywhere close to finding a solution. So in an ideal world...
Maybe we don't need the big organizations anymore in the future. Because they have all these problems, like wanting to earn money and putting out people, and they have another goal.
So what you're thinking, we could have lots and lots of small organizations, which would have subsidies from wealthy people and crowdfunding?
As it happens right now.
Yeah,
it's all small, but it is there. If we compared with 10 years ago, they were not here. Well, apart from the American examples, they exist longer. Which is even better.
So there were some which I talked about in the book. The Center for Public Integrity was already there.
Yeah, they exist longer. And so, but that's so that's a positive
But
argument.
we're going round in circles. So you and I, we can't tell whether or not those kind of alternatives will become big enough to replace.
No,
something has to replace it in scale. You see, what I was trying to say is, in an ideal world, we would capture Facebook and Google and take them into public ownership. Those organizations are too important to be left in private hands, and it's simply wrong, morally, politically, socially, that the huge amounts of profit which they have are being directed according to the desires of a very small number of greedy people, like Mark Zuckerberg. Who the hell is Mark Zuckerberg? Why should he decide what's done with all that money he's taken from all of us? So if it were politically possible, we should do the global equivalent of nationalizing them, taking them into public ownership. And then we could take that profit and divert it to the welfare of our societies. And that would include subsidizing journalism. But the trouble is that because they're global, I don't know that we can find the political strength to do that.
No, because what would we need to change Google and Facebook into public companies? That talking about impossible goals.
Well, it's politically, I can't see a way that it can happen.
No.
But so then I think, has the Dutch government and the Danish government experimented a little bit with putting taxpayers' money into a fund to help journalism?
Yes, they are doing it, and newspapers are paying less taxes than other companies. So in that way, some people say they are already funded by public, and we're here at the public, the NPR, the National Public
So that's a third thing that could possibly happen. Although in the UK, it's become so right-wing that the idea of government doing anything is considered bad. So it's a problem. I don't know anybody in the world of newspapers who knows the solution to the destructive impact of the internet on our finances.
This was also, I guess, your let's say, problem. At the end of your book, you conclude, okay, I've shown you many stories behind the stories. I've talked about flat earth news and churning journalism. Sorry, I don't have any solutions.
Yeah, because there was a lot of criticism of this. I didn't come up with a clever solution at the end of the book. In fact, I said, you know, there are some problems that don't have solutions. You go to the doctor, he says, I'm sorry, you have cancer, and you're going to die. And it could be, you know, there is no law that says all professions have to survive. There is a distinct shortage of arrow makers nowadays. So in 20, 30 years' time, the profession of journalism could be dead. I'm not saying it will be, but it could be. If we don't find a successful way of financing it, then it's going to be. And look at the two things coinciding, that over here, we haven't really talked about this, you have what I call information chaos. That if you look at the information that's now flowing through our channels of communication around the world and ask what proportion of that information is actually false or misleading, I would say the percentage which is false or misleading is higher now than at any time in human history. Not just because of us, but for other reasons as well. So just as that hugely significant problem arises, over here, the profession whose job it is to take statements and say, well, that's true, that's false, and then communicate the result, is in sharp decline. So that's a very, very unfortunate coincidence, because it applies across the board that when you're trying to decide who to make president of the United States, whether the UK should leave the European Union, what's your policy on education, criminal justice, heroin, you need facts. And if governments are sitting there and voters are sitting there on the receiving end of huge streams of false and misleading information, and journalism is failing to do its job in checking, you've got political chaos. So it's information chaos produces policy chaos.
You actually predicted...
I'm pessimistic today.
Yeah, oh, you don't have to underline that.
This is what retired old guys do.
Yeah, well, but I'm afraid you're right, but you kind of predicted Brexit in your book.
Did I?
Yeah.
I don't. Did I?
Oh no, not in your not in your book, but in some talks about your book.
Okay, so one of
you said there's a referendum coming up, and people will tell the British people that they will not be allowed anymore to drink their pints. They will have to drink their beer in liters.
Yeah. So
and that will be a reason for them to want to leave the European Union. To put it very simply.
Yes,
because there's
another aspect to this. So if you take the structural problem, which we've talked about, journalism, then alongside that, you have sheer malicious dishonesty in some subject areas. So in the area of the EU, the British press, for at least 20 years, has been having a great deal of fun by fabricating false stories in order to make the EU look bad.
And they didn't even need PR organizations for that.
No, I think that the worst of that comes from within the newspapers. And it was partly, I think, that the proprietors, the owners, someone like Rupert Murdoch doesn't like the European Union because to some small extent it represents the regulation of a multinational corporation. He doesn't like that. So the proprietors are against it. But also, these were what newspapers regard as great stories. Like Brussels says that all bananas must now be straight. Ah, come on, bloody Brussels. Brussels says we can no longer drink pints of beer. They'll have to be in litres. Now, Brussels says that the Scottish kilt is against the law. So these stories are completely false, but people enjoyed hating Brussels, and the journalists are competing with each other to come up with the next crazy story. And usually the story will have some tiny fragment of truth somewhere in the 10th paragraph of a long report. There would be something to justify 5% of the story. But it just meant the credibility of the EU has been eroded slowly.
So you were not surprised at all?
No, and then why did we have a referendum on this? This was not the idea of the government. This was the idea of the right-wing tabloids who have been campaigning for a referendum for years, and they got their way because they are very powerful. These are bullying people. Because that was the other thing I got into, was trying to expose their bullying and criminality.
With your other book, you mean?
Yeah.
Hack Attack, about the whole world of the news scandal.
But I don't know whether you want to get into that now.
Maybe, but we can also see if there are some questions in the audience. Sorry, there's a microphone coming to you because we're no. Please, no shouting here.
Timo, can we put the lights on, the house lights up a bit more?
Yeah.
Doet hij? Ja, dit is Jaap zeker, ons livestream. Just a small question. Predicting that it probably won't help and they will all vanished within 30 years, which I will be, only because of my age. But as a profession, I mean, why are you going on telling the stories on a global level? Isn't there something left within you that we should do something and that you might help us getting that far?
So this is a personal question about me and my motives. Yeah, it's weird. I can't quite turn it off. So I feel very, very disillusioned about journalism. I really do. And the world in general. It just seems, I just think, fuck it, we can't do anything about this. And so my intention is to spend the remaining part of my life traveling and having interesting experiences and calming down. So the people who do investigative work here will know it can be very stressful. You work very hard, you attack powerful people, the bastards attack you back, you get sued, you get followed in the street. So I just want a quiet life, traveling. But nevertheless, wherever I'm traveling, I'm thinking, that's a story, that's a book. It's like this little mechanism won't quite shut up. But I am trying to resist it. I'm trying to go straight and lead an honest life. See? There's one there. Maybe not all of you are as pessimistic as me.
No, I'm not.
You're not? Okay.
Because actually, the way you're describing what goes wrong is rather the problem of publishers than of journalists. And I agree with the smaller online. One of the things we should be very happy about is the internet bringing forward these small collectives of journalists who churn out stories. They don't churn them out; they just publish them. And the journalism you describe is the old-day journalism with these monoliths of news who are dependent on having advertising income, etc., etc.
Yeah.
And that has led to the downfall of the mainstream journalism. What do you think about that? So, in short, isn't it a problem of publishers instead of journalists?
No, so I agree with you. The structural problem is at the level of the publisher, which is then imposed on the reporters, good people not being allowed to do their job properly. I mean, it's a complicated picture. So I've talked about the negative impacts of the internet. And there are also positive ones. So obviously, the amount of information which a reporter can now access when he or she is forced to stay at a desk all day is far greater now than it used to be. So in that sense, the internet helps reporters. If you're going to set up a news organization, the fact that it can be digital means that it's much cheaper to run. You're not having to pay to print the wretched thing and to distribute it through trains and trucks. So for the new organization, that's a great asset. It's a complicated picture. So the internet is not all bad, and I've tended to focus on the bad. In some ways, it helps us. But you're right, at the level of the publisher, there is a structural problem which is killing off the mainstream news organizations. And there's a kind of debate here about whether you can replace them with these alternative models. At the moment, I doubt it. But we need a profession that checks and tells people. And that profession has to operate on a global scale. And it has to have the skills. Reporting that is skillful. And it needs resources. And I think it also needs accountability. Those three things. And we haven't really talked about this, that alongside the problems in mainstream news, there are the problems of social media themselves, where this is familiar, but there are now millions of people out there who are not just consuming information that suits their prejudice, they're generating it as well. So that you're getting these whirlpools. Here are the racists telling each other racist things, and here are the Catholics doing it, and here are the communists, and here are the people who believe the world is controlled by the Illuminati. Maybe it is. And they're all exchanging falsehoods, swirling round and round and round, reinforcing each other's beliefs. And somewhere in amongst there are people who actually go further and set up a news organization online. And this is dangerous. This is unaccountable and skill-less. It's bullshit disguised as news. So alongside our failure, you've got that. And then don't lose track of the third one, which is state propaganda. The expression fake news in England is being reduced to mean what Russians do online. And that's not good enough. It's this huge spectrum of the generation of falsehood. And where you're looking at propaganda, the NATO countries are absolutely involved in producing falsehood.
What are you saying about fake news in Great Britain? It's only seen as news from the Russians, and so...
Yeah, the expression fake news, I think, is problematic. It either isn't clear what it means, or it means Russian state propaganda.
Yeah, so it means, they say it means we don't do those things.
Yeah, and yes. But, so I personally, I wouldn't use the expression fake news. I talk about information chaos. So the mainstream news organizations, what we've been talking about, the social media, these idiots, but there's millions and millions of them. And then state propaganda, which I would say is more active globally now than ever. And can I tell a quick story? I had an amazing time researching Flat Earth News, where I started looking at propaganda. Now, propaganda is not the same as PR. Propaganda is military and intelligence agencies producing falsehood in order to achieve a political, military, or diplomatic goal. Okay. Looking back, we can now see that during the Cold War, the biggest news organization in the world was not Reuters or the Associated Press, it was the CIA, who owned or controlled news organizations in every country on the planet, which is far more than Reuters or AP. The Cold War ends, their budget is reduced, it goes into decline, and then the terrorist attacks of September 2001. Money starts pouring back. Okay, so come forward 5 years. I'm researching Flat Earth News. I have a guy in British military intelligence who's talking to me about propaganda. And he says, I'll tell you what, there's a big conference in London. All the NATO countries are sending their people. They don't call it propaganda, they call it strategic communications, but it's propaganda. So they're all having this big meeting, and because the world is now privatized, they're selling tickets. So for £1,000, thank you, Guardian, I filled in a form, Nick Davis, and I put Guardian, which looks like a security company. And I gave them £1,000, and then I walk into this conference, and there are all these guys with crew cuts and muscles, and they're all talking strategic communications. And just on a sideline, everybody is saying hello to everybody at the beginning, and after about half an hour, the word got around that this guy wasn't quite right. So everything stopped, and there was a huddle around me, and some people were saying, go. And then my British military intelligence guy was in there as well, and he was being more sympathetic. And I said, the thing is, you have a contract with me. I've paid £1,000. I have not lied on the form. So I have a contract. I'm entitled to be here, so I'm not going. So in the end, we made a deal. I could write and report everything that was said. I could write and report everybody who was there, but I couldn't connect the names to the quotes. And that was good enough. So I stayed, this went on for 2 days, and so in enormous detail, I was able to see the scale on which they had rebuilt the machinery of propaganda, now called strategic communications. As a single point, if you simply look at the US military setup, they have 5, they call them core competencies: Army, Navy, Air Force, Special Forces, strategic communications. It's that big. Right, so that's there as well. They are manufacturing falsehood and pouring it out. Or stories to do with Al-Qaeda or ISIS are riddled with falsehood. Again, in the book I found some examples, and you can almost visualize these guys in strategic communications, and they're sitting there in their office, and they're laughing at us. Can we invent a story that is so ridiculous that these guys won't print it? Actually, no, they'll print anything we come up with.
Like the example you gave in the book about al-Zarqawi.
Yeah, you remember Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, except that he wasn't the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq for most of that period of time. The crucial thing about Zarqawi is that he was Jordanian, and the American strategic communications objective was to deny the fact that there was an insurgency by Iraqi people. They wanted to rearrange that so that it's a problem of foreign fighters. And Zarqawi was ideal for that purpose. So you say it's all about Zarqawi. This bomb going off, this attack, this assassination, this shooting, it's all Zarqawi, foreign fighters coming into Iraq and upsetting things. And courtesy of other reporters, actually, interestingly enough, we were able to get a long way into that, to identify specific stories which had been planted and specific reporters who had gone along with it. And that was a big global story.
And according to those stories, it must have been that al-Zarqawi was on 10 different places at the same time.
Oh, it was better than that. So actually, Zarqawi first surfaced in February 2003, the month before the invasion, when Colin Powell went to the Security Council of the United Nations. You remember he gave this huge presentation. And he talked then about how a senior figure from Al-Qaeda had become injured in Afghanistan and had been allowed to go to Baghdad, where Saddam Hussein's surgeons had operated on him and removed his leg. Now, this was about creating an entirely fictional, false link between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda. And afterwards, Colin Powell's people briefed reporters to say, well, this is this guy, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. He was with Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, which was completely false, and he had this operation and lost a leg in Baghdad. Okay. Then you fast forward a little bit, and there was this terrible moment when for the first time we saw Westerners in orange jumpsuits kneeling down and having their throats cut in front of a camera. And there was this guy dressed completely in black and masked with the curved knife who was doing the killing. And he also was Zarqawi. And then you look, this is remarkable, the strength of Al-Qaeda, because Zarqawi has grown a second leg. And you might think reporters would have said, some part of this story can't be quite true. Either that wasn't Zarqawi or this wasn't Zarqawi. Actually, neither of them was Zarqawi. But never mind the detail, come on, it's a story. I mean, do you see what I'm talking about? The brazenness, do you know that word, of these guys? That we can invent anything. We can say what we like. The good old reporters will churn it out. There are good reporters out there. I don't want to get the point wrong. It's bad organizations.
How did you pick up your journalistic work after Flat Earth News, while you must have been as depressed as you are now already?
Well, so a weird thing happened that... So when I was researching Flat Earth News, which is about falsehood and propaganda, I'm talking to reporters from other news organizations. And some of them started to talk about the fact that their news organizations were committing crimes in order to get information. So they were hacking into email messages and also hacking into voicemail messages on the mobile telephones of politicians or celebrities or sports people. So I included in this book a little chapter about that. It was kind of out of place because it wasn't really about falsehood, but I stuck it in there. So then the book comes out, and I was on the BBC radio program in the morning. It's called Today. It's a very, very important program. It's very frightening being on there because you think everybody's listening, the Prime Minister, the Queen, or God. And what they did was that they had me to talk about everything going wrong, and then they had two other senior editors to disagree with me. And it's a funny thing they do in radio, you might maybe know this, that they were worried that we might actually start physically attacking each other. So I'm in one studio, and the two editors are 100 meters away in another studio, but then they merged. We never did
that. We enhanced the people.
Okay.
Yeah, we hoped the people would...
oh, you want them fighting?
Yeah.
Oh, that's television, not radio. So anyway...
We had webcams.
At one point, one of the people in the other room was the managing editor of the News of the World, Rupert Murdoch's big Sunday newspaper. So the interviewer asked me about the chapter about journalists committing crime, and I blah, 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 and then he says, "This is nonsense. I don't know what planet Mr. Davies comes from, but he's living on another planet." He rubbished it. Well, this was a bad mistake, because out there, apart from the Prime Minister and the Queen, there was a man listening who I had never heard of. And a day or two later, he sent me an email. He said, I heard what that man said. I need to talk to you. Here is my phone number. Don't leave a voicemail message. Now, that proved to be very significant, because he was my guide into this scandal, which was about the News of the World, hacking the emails, hacking the voicemail messages. But more than that, the real scandal, which this guy knew, was that the police, Scotland Yard, the great metropolitan police, already had detailed evidence that the News of the World were committing these crimes every day, every working day. And they were not doing anything about it because Rupert Murdoch has too much power. So from the word go, this wasn't really a story about journalists breaking the law. It's a story about power in the UK and the way in which some of those newspapers have got themselves into a very, very powerful position where they can bully government into doing what they want. Brexit et al. And I think journalists, we like to campaign. We want to create change. That's where I started. But if you're doing that by using falsehood and bullying behind the scenes, you're cheating. You're not functioning as a journalist. And if you're using falsehood, the outcome will be disastrous for the country. If journalism isn't about truth, well, it isn't journalism, is it? It has to be an attempt to tell the truth. So, but from that, so I never really got a chance to stop and breathe, because Flat Earth News turned into the phone hacking scandal, which just took off and became terrifying, really.
Yeah, and now you're retired, and you disillusioned about journalism, you said.
Well, you see,
but there are people here who are still working in journalism. Yeah. So, what would you do if you would still have to work or wanted to work?
Yeah, so I would still be tempted.
You can't leave us like this.
No, okay, so the first reason for becoming a journalist is that you get paid to do interesting things. That's pretty outrageously good, to meet interesting people, see interesting things. So, you mean there are music critics who get paid to go to rock groups? I mean, this is not bad. Travel journalists get paid to go on holiday. Sports journalists paid to watch football. So, and just at that level, before you start trying to change the world, it's pretty good. So, and then beyond that, yeah, it's wonderful to be paid to hurt bad people. And I was trying to be careful in my wording early on that it's not absolutely impossible. It's just much more difficult. So we've had an example very recently in the UK of a journalist at The Guardian who wrote about the Windrush generation. This is the migrants who came from the Caribbean to the UK during the 1950s. And now, all these decades later, their citizenship is being questioned. If you don't have paperwork from 1956, out. And you can't, while you're here, you can't have health service, you can't have benefits, you can't work. And she doggedly wrote that story over a period of 6 months. And she finally broke through. That's the first difficulty. And she got a relatively good reaction from government. She didn't sink into the swamp of falsehood and unreason. So it can still be done. But it's against the grain. So I mean, I suppose if I was starting out again, I probably would want to be a journalist. That idea that you can change the world with words is very, very exciting. So the fantasy would keep me going, I think.
The fantasy.
Fantasy and vodka.
Yeah, but
Where would you work then?
You see, I probably would work either at The Guardian or the BBC. I think, but I may be old-fashioned here, but I think it's helpful to work in an organization that's big enough that if you can play the office politics, so it's important to have a senior executive who's your protector. And then the organization is big enough they can say, okay, Nick, you go and do that story. You don't have to do 5 stories a day and sit in stupid press conferences. Go and bring down the government. But I think you're more likely to get that freedom in the big organization than in the little ones that we've been talking about. But I mean, I speak at quite a lot of journalism conferences, and I do come across those people from little organizations doing great stories, and I may say being very brave.
They do have the freedom and the time to make their stories.
Well, what it is actually, it's young people working for almost nothing. They haven't got children, they're not trying to buy a house or anything.
Yes,
these are people,
that's true.
They've just left university. So another good thing that's happening is this profession still attracts bright, idealistic young people who want to make the world a better place and who want to get paid to listen to rock music. So that's good. And to see them, they've amazing energy. So it's not all bad. But you say to one of those young people, they're working now for peanuts. Are you going to be able to live the rest of your life and have 2.6 children and all that stuff without just surviving on peanuts? At some stage, aren't you going to need a decent income?
So,
please
take a microphone. We don't hear you.
I mean, the basic problem is money at the end of the day, whatever way, no matter how idealistic we are. But there's a lot of talk about putting a price on data.
What does that mean?
Like when I use Facebook, they have data on me, and they use the data for other means. So I used to, in old times, my hourly rate was due to my labor over an hour. But nowadays, you can calculate your work, the journalist's work, the data they provide to Facebook or to another organization.
But
do you understand this question?
I think I do. If you measure...
What is the question? Could you please...
I think he's saying that you could measure the contribution of a journalist by looking at the amount of data they produce.
That's right.
For Facebook and Google. I'm not quite sure how you would convert that into money.
Yeah, not me neither, but I mean, I'm just thinking about the idea. There's the value of your work and of the Guardian's work. You said earlier the Guardian's data, the data that Google gets from the Guardian's work is very valuable, and they use it in other ways to get advertisers.
Yes, hang on. We're confusing two different things. What Facebook and Google are getting is the user data of the readers. Yeah. So that when the reader comes through Google to read a story on The Guardian, they're using cookies. They have a complete profile of that reader. So that and they crunch it all together, and then if they want to find 65-year-old men from England who want to spend the weekend in Amsterdam for advertisers, I'm in there with is that all dirty old men? But you see, so they're crunching that data. You're talking not about the user data of readers, but the data which journalists produce.
Yeah, I'm talking about both.
But it's very dangerous to try to assess the value of a journalist's work by looking at the volume that they produce. I worked for the Sunday newspaper in the UK, The Observer, for a while, and I was doing these bloody investigations. And the idiots upstairs in the money part of the paper did this. And it turned out the most valuable journalist on the paper was the property correspondent, because every week there was a page full of advertising of houses for sale, and he always had 1,200 words to fill. Oh yeah, the housing market's really depressed this week. So he looked like he was the best reporter. In fact, he spent most of his life in the pub. Sorry, if you're still alive, I don't really mean that.
Yeah, there's another question.
I don't really agree with your point that you say there's less truth coming out now.
No, sorry. No, I really didn't mean that. Sorry. No, you don't agree that there's less truth now? Go on.
Yeah, I'm not a journalist. I'm just a user of the internet, and I read a lot of books and papers when I was younger. But my feeling, and a lot of people have the same feeling, is that journalists are less free than before, much less free than before to tell the truth, which makes a gap for people to find out themselves. And because of the internet, we have contact ourselves with people over the place. So I have contact with people in Gaza, for example. I have contact with people in Syria who tell me what's really going on there. And I have contact with other people who have contact with other people.
So you're saying you don't need journalists anymore?
No, I don't say I don't need journalists anymore, but we are very sad and concerned about the fact that journalism is not free enough anymore.
When you say journalists are not as free as they were or should be, I agree with you, but I wonder what you are thinking is what is restricting the freedom of journalists,
for example,
in your view?
I have two examples, or even three, but let's take two. One is the poison in Holland. We are selling poisonous oil to boats.
No, but I don't mean the stories, but what is it? Is it the government that's restricting their freedom, or is it the financial problems that I'm talking about? Or
well,
the proprietors?
I think that the money which is paying...
So we're agreed on that. But let me ask you a second question.
Yeah.
If you're looking to ordinary citizens, let's say in Syria, and some of those citizens say, Assad and the Russians have been using chemical weapons to kill civilians. And then other people say, that is propaganda. That never happened. How do you, sitting in the Netherlands, distinguish between the two? How do you decide who's telling the truth about the use of chemical weapons in Syria?
Yeah, that depends on several proofs which point at the same thing. So only one proof is not enough. Second proof is not enough. For example, with this propaganda, we had photos of children which were attacked, but they were on different places. They were the same children, so they show. And
so you think the chemical weapons were not used?
They were not used by Assad. They were used in Egypt, and these photos have been used, for example.
Okay, so this is what worries me, because I've seen the two sides on the internet, and it's interesting that the ability to examine evidence and distinguish it seems to me very low, because reporting has skills. And so, for example, there was a photograph coming out of the chemical weapons. There was a man who wrote a very famous tweet saying, as a cardiologist, I am telling you that the heart wires, you know, with the little white discs on this child's chest are in the wrong place. Therefore, this photograph is phony. Therefore, I don't believe the chemical weapons were used. He was called Thomas Bryden, I think, from Vienna. Okay, that tweet went into tens of thousands of copies. A few days later, he tweeted again, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. There's nothing wrong with that photograph. And that tweet got about 100, right? Yeah. So it was wrong. Yeah. But it gets taken up and repeated by people who want to believe that it's all a conspiracy and that the chemical weapons weren't used. And what you need, I think, still, is professional people who have the skills and the resources and the accountability to check.
Yeah, but we lost already a long time ago the trust on that.
I doubt whether you are genuinely entitled to say, as a matter of truth, that chemical weapons were not used
No,
in Syria?
I don't even put myself there, but I only say this is what we are investigating on a free base, because we don't get the truth anymore. The most important things are silenced. For example, about this 5G network, which is now rolling out.
But just on that, I thought you did say they didn't use chemical weapons in Syria, they used them in Egypt and one or two other places. Isn't that what you said 3 minutes ago?
Yeah, I said it, but it's...
I think
I
so
know I cannot be 100% sure, so I'm not.
Okay,
I'm not
but your
saying
point
that
is
it's
clear.
true.
Your point is clear.
I'm only investigating on it because it's not done by others, and because there is an enormous amount of lies coming over our heads already 7 years about this country. So I'm really angry even.
But I think it sounds to me that you are doing better than an awful lot of people on social media. A lot of I had this really frustrating meeting at the end of last week. I was in a meeting of journalists, and there were these two young people. And without getting lost in the detail of the story, they were using sentence structures like this. I don't have any evidence, but I think. And then, I'm not saying this is the truth, but I think. Now, those sentences should be structured this way. I don't have any evidence, full stop. I go and find the evidence. Then I decide what I think. If once you allow yourself to think in those ways, I don't have any evidence, but here's what I think, all statements are of equal value. The utterly false ones and the utterly true ones. They're all of equal value. And that sort of mentality, that resistance to the basic structures of reason, has become like an infection that's spread on the internet. It sounds to me as though you're not thinking in that way. You're being more sophisticated.
But it's frightening. Also learning.
Thank you. There's another question. Your point is clear. Thank you.
Hi. It's a very technical question, actually. You talked about user data.
Yeah.
People saying, well, I'm on Facebook and it's for free and I can stay in touch with all my friends and family around the world. But actually it's not free. We're giving up our data. So some people in the Netherlands have formed a data union. So they say, well, my data is a commodity like my labor can be, and now I want to sit at the table with Google and Facebook talking about how they use my data and what I would get for it in return. Do you think that's a possible solution?
I didn't quite understand because you were talking very fast. I'm so sorry.
I'm sorry.
So your English is better than mine. So
thank you.
Have these people first of all cancelled their Facebook and Google accounts, or do they keep them going?
I don't know all of them personally.
But is it that they form a union and then they go and have meetings with Facebook and Google?
That's what they are trying to reach. I think they've just established the union.
And so then are they saying, if you use my data,
I should have a say in what you're doing with it. I should be at the table, like
just to know.
As a laborer, I should be at the same table as the people who employ me.
But it would be interesting, going back to what this guy was saying, that maybe national governments could pass legislation that says user data has a commercial value. If a company within our jurisdiction uses the data of citizens within this jurisdiction, they must pay for it.
Right.
And that money needs to go into a pot, and then the money can be diverted back into journalism or paying for hospitals or whatever we the people want.
So
is there a model there?
There's a...
He needs a mic. We're about to solve the problem.
It makes sense what both of you are saying, but I'm not here to defend Facebook or Google at all, but the deal from the start was, and a deal is a deal, you use our services for free and you give us your data. So I don't think it's fair to later on say, now I have to pay for your data. So it is the deal you make when you start to use Google and Facebook. So just stop.
Okay, but how about
them? At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, there were also no unions, and after a while, we realized we should have a say in things.
Yeah, and it's the same. Hang on, this is good, but it's the same with the whole business of regulating the commercial sector grows up with that pattern that the companies emerge, they're not regulated, and at a certain point, we the people, democracy, all that stuff, we come in and say, okay, you guys, now there's going to be some rules around here. So it would be reasonable to say to Facebook and Google, carry on functioning, carry on with the same business model, but we, the democratically elected government, are saying to you, where our citizens are concerned, we're now going to start you charging something and it's not going to put you out of business, but it is going to allow us to fund very important things. And bear in mind, those organizations know that they are being destructive towards various parts of our society, specifically including journalism. Look at the number of journalism conferences that are now sponsored by Facebook and Google, desperately trying to buy some goodwill. So I think they might even regard that as a political safety valve, that it might release some of the hostility that's building up towards them.
Do you consider that as a good thing?
Well, on the understanding that I know fuck all about data, Facebook, that I don't really understand these things, I think it's rather an interesting possibility. But I'm only a humble citizen, not an expert.
There's another question over there.
Mr. Davies, very interesting talk you gave. May I suggest a kind of a picture that in the 20th century, of course, journalists have this controlling function for politicians, for governments. In the 19th century, parliaments came up. So politicians, members of parliament had that control function. The government or the Kaiser or the Tsar had to account to the parliament. But then they became a big family, and there came a new institution to control, the journalists. Right. So I think in the 20th century, journalists have this bit the same control function that that members of parliament had in the 19th and start 20th century. And well, perhaps their century is over now too, and in the next century, in the 21st century, there will be another group that controls the public power. Well, maybe. That's the question. What do you think of that?
But who would that be? Who would now be the point of accountability?
I don't know, but perhaps your pessimism about journalism. Well, I think there will be another group to control what happens and decision makers. Once these were the parliamentaries,
yes, but so
now there are journalists, and there will be another group.
It's very difficult to foresee the future, of course. So you can see one possibility is that you will have these strong men, leaders, Trump, Duterte, and others like in Poland and Hungary, who are anti-democratic, even though they emerge through democratic systems. And they don't really care about public reaction because they're dealing in falsehood and unreason. And Duterte and Trump have been, in the Philippines, and Trump have been particularly clever at simply repelling truthful attacks by dealing in another language, by simply dealing in falsehood. So you may be going into an era of pragmatic tyrants. They don't necessarily arrest, torture, and murder their populations, but they dominate them, manipulate them. So it would be a slightly more benign form of totalitarianism. I am pessimistic.
Yeah, pragmatic tyrants.
Maybe fairies will descend from the sky and take over, and everything will be fine, and there'll be MDMA for breakfast, and life will be great. Maybe. Facebook and Google can fund it.
I just have a...
Yeah.
I have a question about the phone hacking, just to go back to your story. Did you see any change after all the public, and she came back, and did anything happen that gave you any kind of hope? Maybe perhaps in audiences wanting different news or changing the way they read or look at the news?
Okay, so the phone hacking scandal, I think, did achieve one thing, that journalists in the UK, I believe, are not committing crimes anymore to get the information for their stories. Beyond that, I thought we might get a decent regulator. And this would be very important in the context of what we've been talking about, because a decent regulator would require these newspapers to abide by the code of conduct, which they themselves have written. And the first paragraph of that code says, if we publish anything false or misleading, we will correct it. Now, they do not do that. If they had been doing that, we wouldn't be leaving the European Union, da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And so I thought if we had a decent independent regulator that would finally require them to do that, that would be great. The irony is that those newspapers attacked that possibility with a tsunami of exactly the kind of false and misleading stories which makes it necessary. And at the end, they won. So just in the last month or so, that's been kicked out. The British government capitulated. They're so busy dealing with Brexit and other horrors, they haven't got the backbone to have another fight with the press. So they've won. So we haven't got a decent regulator. Beyond that, the big structures of power, absolutely unchanged. On the specific point about whether readers have changed their requirement, there's always been a contradiction. If you go out among the British public and do the opinion poll, over and over again they will say newspapers should not invade people's privacy, for example. But when the newspapers invade the privacy, those same people buy the papers to find out about the celebrity sex life or whatever it is. So there's always been that contradiction. I don't think that's really changed at all.
Or the people say they want positive news.
Yeah, but bad news better. You know, if it bleeds, it leads. You've heard that saying. Violence sells newspapers. I think that, I mean, this, I may be wrong, but I think one of the decisive factors over the next 10 years will be Prince Harry and Meghan Markle, that she in particular is so charismatic that the tabloids will not be able to leave her alone. Diana was a crucial turning point in the earlier history of our tabloid newspapers, that when I was young and growing up and through my 20s, the royal family were effectively behind an invisible wall. The tabloids were running around everywhere else, but not inside that wall. And then comes Diana. She's irresistible. So they break through, and they're into her private life, they're into her sex life, her lovers, they're intercepting her phone calls, everything. And eventually they kill her. It's not too much of an exaggeration. Those photographers drove her into that accident. Okay, so then they've backed off a bit, but I think Meghan Markle will take them back into that territory, and that will revive our worst fears about those ways that the newspapers can behave. But I don't know, but that just seems to me possible.
Just another question about solutions, possible solutions.
Yeah.
You don't have a strong belief in small publishers, small journalistic startups, but there are some of the tech giants moving into publishing, like Apple starting television, Netflix is starting a weekly journalism show with BuzzFeed.
Oh, I didn't know that, yeah.
Amazon's moving into television. Do you believe they can, maybe in the future, function as independent journalistic publishers?
Well, maybe. I mean, they have got huge amounts of money, and that's the seed that's producing this problem. So Amazon already rescued the Washington Post, which was in sharp decline. The newspaper that did the Watergate scandal was almost dead on the floor. So does he pronounce his name Bezos, the owner of... Is it Bezos or Bezos?
Bezos.
Bezos, okay. Bezos buys the Washington Post, and he's put money in. As far as I'm aware, he's not interfering in its political line, and they've started to function again and to do good stories. So it's possible, if those guys will put money into serious and independent journalism, it would be great. There's too much money being sucked out of our newsrooms and into their pockets, and it needs to come back. And if it comes back voluntarily, great. Otherwise, we the people will rise in our anger with our pitchforks and take it from them.
Over here, and over there, right up in the back.
But isn't it really a shame that all this money goes to printed products?
To what products?
To printed products, a 19th century invention, which has had its heydays, and is in fact on the way out. Shouldn't we invent another platform?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody believes that the printed paper is on the way out. It's just about arithmetic. At the moment, if you take The Guardian as an example, it is selling enough copies and carrying enough advertising in the printed paper to pay for its production and distribution. And, oh, there's a bad person.
There's some nice music coming up.
It has to happen in every meeting. So at the moment, the printed paper is generating profit. But as the sales of the printed paper decline and the amount of advertising it carries declines, there will come a break point. And then the news organizations will say, okay, we're not going to print that anymore. You know, The Independent in London has already stopped printing. So I guess at some point in the next 5 or 10 years, most of them will stop printing. And that in itself is not so bad. A digital paper is cheaper to produce and distribute. You reach far more people. It's very exciting writing for the internet. Because I was writing for The Guardian, we would reach, let's say, 400,000 people a day. Once the website was established, we were reaching millions all around the world. And the story stays there. It doesn't die so soon. That is, if you can break through. Here's the problem. If we have the digital newspaper, the digital news organization, how will it pay for itself? If you put up the paywall and ask people to pay to come over, the experience in the UK is that most of your readers go away. So you have a tiny number of readers, and therefore your impact is much reduced. Or you can look for advertising, and then we run into our friends at Facebook and Google.
Or we have the porous paywall, so you can go in once in a while.
Yes, I think... Sorry.
But before we get to that, I said there are 2 more questions, and then we have to finish. Oh. So I would like to ask you to put the microphone up there. Okay. Oh, you have a microphone, okay.
It's on?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, not for the professional use, but for consumer use. I don't know whether you have children or even grandchildren.
All of that.
All of that. My son doesn't touch, he's 18, a printed paper. I don't even know what kind of news he consumes, but what would you recommend parents, consumers, your own skeptical attitude?
Well,
Which
what
sources would you still recommend for consumption of possibly credible information?
Okay, so...
On what do you rely yourself?
Okay, so I read The Guardian each day. And at the very least, that tells me what news organizations are saying about the world. And that's interesting. And because I'm a journalist, I can often, like with Skripal, I can read it and I can see the gaps. I can see the PR material. Sometimes I can see the propaganda. If there was a particular subject that I really needed to know about, let's say they tell me that there's a new outbreak of Ebola in some part of Western Africa, and I'm about to fly there, I really need to know, then I would get on the telephone and speak to experts in universities. I'd speak, I guess, to my doctor, I'd speak to the British Foreign Office. I would have to do my own research to check.
So you agree with this lady who says, I'm not counting on journalists anymore?
No, that's my whole point, is that we are structurally likely to produce falsehood and distortion. I'm not disagreeing with her about that at all. And she also saw it the same way. It's the financial thing that's restricting our freedom to tell the truth. I think that's right. You see, a lot of people think that the restriction on our freedom is the proprietors who smoke cigars and lean down from on high and they play us like puppets. That's the old model. That's the 1920s and 30s, a generation of owners who were propagandists. I don't know any owners like that anymore. It's a commercial model now. It's about making profit. It's even true with someone like Rupert Murdoch. He primarily wants to make money. He manipulates governments in order to allow him to make even more money. He doesn't very often manipulate his journalists. He does sometimes, but not too often.
Last question, please.
Yeah. I have a question about censored. When you get censored, like as a journalist.
Yeah.
For example, there is this big problem for me about 5G. And there's not a lot of information in the mainstream media about the dangers of it.
Okay, on 5G I know nothing. It's not something I've researched or I'm aware of. But if you see news organizations failing to tell the truth about important things, in my experience, 40 years, it's very unlikely that you're looking at a conspiracy. You're not looking at governments and police officers going into newsrooms and saying, we don't want you to say this. You're looking at these much more subtle things. And you're looking at the PR industry. So I don't know about 5G. I can't talk to you about it. But we haven't quite...
Well, I can have another...
No, sorry.
Well, I don't mind.
You were still elaborating on your first question. And that's going to be the
it's
last,
just that
unfortunately.
When you look at the PR industry, it's only a small proportion of what they put out is actually false. What's much more important is that they decide what should be said about their government department or trade union or corporation or celebrity individual. And clearly they are going to choose to say something which makes that customer look good. And so even if what they're saying is true, that's not enough. It's not journalism. You have to have somebody outside those organizations and individuals who says, this is what we need to say. So I don't know anything about 5G. I don't know the first thing about it. But what I would not be surprised to discover is that the corporations and others who are involved in developing that are controlling what is said. It's not censorship, which was the first word you used. It's PR. It's much easier than censorship. It doesn't involve anybody threatening or using the law or political power against a journalist. That's the model you get in a totalitarian society. It's worse here. You don't need a system of censorship to have a media which consistently fails to tell you important truths, which is what we've already got. Do you see? So the old language of censorship is out of date. The language of conspiracy, by and large, is out of date. It's there, the front door.
So would your last advice be to journalists and consumers, be more suspicious?
Yeah, I think there's a good word, which is to be skeptical.
Or skeptical.
So an awful lot of our work as reporters now is to be chained to a keyboard, recycling the agency copy and the PR material. But when I used to teach one-day masterclasses in investigative reporting, and we would talk about how to find stories. And the kind of cliche model is that we meet these strange people in the dark corners of multi-story car parks, and they tell us to follow the money. But my argument is that actually journalists find stories by training themselves to think in a rather bizarre way, that we notice everything that doesn't quite make sense. Like, why has Mr. Skripal got an expensive car in front of his not expensive house? Well, he must have a source of income. So what is it? You notice every little thing that isn't quite making sense, that doesn't quite fit the picture. And that applies when you're reading the agency copy and when you're reading the press release. Because if you're the press officer working for the government department and something bad has happened and you've got to put it in the public domain, but you're embarrassed by it, you will try to put it in the public domain in such a way that nobody notices. So you'll write an intro, which is perfectly boring, and somewhere in the 4th paragraph or in a footnote, you'll put the killer piece of information. But if you're a good reporter and you've trained your mind to work in this weird way so you spot everything that doesn't quite make sense, you go, fucking hell, that's the intro, that's the story, and you change it. Do you see? So even within these horrible constraints that we work in, you can still function. I forgot what the question is. And
no, this is perfect. This end cut, I would say. This is a perfect ending. Thank you so much. Yeah. I guess you could go on for a while still, but we're done. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Can I add to that I started off with an apology to you, Nick Davies, and I need to make another one because I told you already, but I didn't tell you. I got him a present and I left it on the piano at home. So, adding insult to injury, I did bring a present for Frederique.
Thank you.
And you are going to get yours in the hotel because it's close to the piano, and I'll bring it over there. I'm terribly sorry. Can I have one more big hand, please, for Nick Davies and Frederique de Jonge? And he brought a present. Yay!
At least something. Yeah.
Okay.
I wonder what it is. A book?
Be skeptical.
Yeah. A liquid book.
Yeah.
Oké, so we're finished, yeah?
Yes. Ja. Even, dames en heren, de ledenvergadering begint straks over een kwartiertje. Dan hebben we hier wat tafels neergezet en dan gaan we hier dus vrolijk door. Voor degenen van u die niet meedoen aan die ledenvergadering, hartelijk dank voor uw komst. En mag ik toch nog even de marktkoopvrouw spelen. Buiten is een staattafel. Daar liggen van die formulieren op met meer informatie over de VVOJ. En heel misschien zet u dat ertoe aan om eens na te denken over een donateurschap of misschien wel een lidmaatschap. Er liggen ook jaarboeken en essays van de VVOJ om in te kijken. Als u een lid wordt, kunt u die meteen meenemen. Nou ja, goed, genoeg gezegd. En u kunt ze ook nog loskopen. Kijk maar even in de boeken wat de prijs is. Hartelijk dank voor uw komst allemaal. En aan de rest, over een kwartiertje gaan we verder. Tot dan.